I would like to call upon Ihor Kozak to introduce our guest of honor. Пані та панове, Ihor Kozak is the Vice President of the League of Ukrainian Canadians. He is a retired, decorated Canadian military officer, successful businessman, professional, and a Ukrainian-Canadian community leader. Ihor was born and raised in Ukraine, and he's the first immigrant from the former USSR to be accepted into the Royal Military College of Canada. Mr. Kozak is a recipient of the Top 25 Canadian Immigrants Award, and in 2015, the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, presented Ihor Kozak with one of 50 Canadian flags on the occasion of our national flag's 50th anniversary. Please welcome Ihor Kozak.
Доброго вечора, вельмишановна українська громадо. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker at this momentous celebration. It is also a significant challenge. The Right Honorable Stephen Harper led Canada during some of its most successful years, as well as through the world's most complex geopolitical, economic, and security challenges for nearly 10 years. And therefore, he does not require an introduction per se. When I began thinking about this moment of introducing our guest of honor, I instantly had a recollection of an unforgettable experience in my own life, which I would like to very briefly share with all of you tonight. 6 years ago, having occupied Crimea, the Kremlin's war machine invaded the Donbass. Ukraine was fighting for its very survival and represented the only force engaged in combat and standing between the Russian aggressors and security and stability of Europe. Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and London, struggling to recover from the shock caused by Putin's blitzkrieg, behaved meekly, to say the least. Only Ottawa demonstrated true leadership by calling Moscow actions what they were: an act of war against Ukraine and aggression against the entire free world. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that it was due to the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper that Russia was kicked out of the G8. Only Prime Minister Stephen Harper dared to tell Vladimir Putin at a G20 summit in Australia to, quote, "Get out of Ukraine." Canada applied serious sanctions against Russia in short order. Canada, punching way above its weight, began supplying Ukrainian soldiers with much-needed military equipment. On that particular day during the spring of 2015, I was visiting the most forward position in the Donbass, separating Russian forces and their mercenaries on the one hand, and Ukrainian forces and true battalions, the volunteer battalions, on the other. I was there to deliver assistance from the Friends of Ukraine Defense Forces Fund, the same fund for which we are fundraising tonight. Also, as requested by the Prime Minister's office and members of Parliament, several of whom are present with us here tonight, I was investigating how our Canadian military equipment was being used right at the front lines by Ukrainian troops. A mortar attack by the Russian terrorist forces began suddenly. The shelling seemed to have lasted forever. Once it was over, I was approached by a young Ukrainian soldier with an innocent, open face. He pointed at his bulletproof vest, which I, as a retired Canadian military officer, instantly recognized, as we say in the military, a piece of Canadian military kit, a Canadian military equipment that Canada, several months prior to that, sent to the Ukrainian troops. The ballistic vest was partially penetrated by shrapnel. The soldier smiled at me and said, "Thank you, Canada, for saving my life." Then he asked me many questions about our country, about our people, our way of life, culture, government system, and our leader. He was particularly interested, very curious, why we Canadians far away across the ocean cared about Ukraine, and why our government was helping the Ukrainian military. Before saying goodbye, he, using his pocket knife, dug out that shrapnel and gave it to me, saying, "If you have an opportunity and the moment is right, please give your Prime Minister this Russian souvenir as a small gift from Ukrainian freedom fighters so they would know what Canada is doing for us makes a real difference and that we truly appreciate it." Ladies and gentlemen, almost 6 years have passed since then. I lost count how many times I went back to the Donbass. We delivered a lot of military assistance to Ukraine. Personally, I collected many war stories and many war souvenirs. Regrettably, I haven't stayed in touch with that young Ukrainian warrior. I pray he return home safely. The war in eastern Ukraine still goes on, and Ukrainian troops continue fighting, making the ultimate sacrifice almost every single day. The latest escalation, this week's escalation at the Donbass, with severe casualties and severe fighting, only underlines my point. This brave Ukrainian men and women in uniform fighting for their homeland and for their families, but also for stability and security of the free world and for our Canadian values. Freedom, above all, as well as democracy, the rule of law, human rights. At the same time, Vladimir Putin and his evil regime continues challenging, threatening us in Canada and all Western democracies. And we too continue fighting back, as does the Right Honorable Stephen Harper, who in his travels around the world continues challenging the Kremlin thugs by telling the truth to the world, continues fighting for Canada, for Ukraine, for all of us. And so, it gives me a great pleasure to finally present to you, sir, the memento from that Russian shelling that I and the Ukrainian soldier experienced and whose life you have saved. I am honored to tell you, sir, on behalf of all of us, echoing that young Ukrainian warrior's words, that what you have done and what you continue doing makes a real difference, and that we truly, truly, truly appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a champion of freedom, a defender of democracy, a true friend of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Canadian community, Canada's 22nd Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Stephen Harper.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, friends. Thank you for that extremely warm welcome. I really Appreciate it. Geez, there are so many dignitaries I should salute tonight. I'll be quick. Ambassador, wonderful to see you. Former Ambassador of Canada, delighted that you're here. Representatives from all levels of government. I should make particular note of my friends and former parliamentary colleagues who are here. James Bazan, Peter Kent, Peter MacKay, Ted Opitz, Aaron O'Toole. That was alphabetical order, just so we're clear. Give them another hand. Guests of the head table, sponsors and organizers, ladies and gentlemen, friends, as I say, thank you very much. And thank you to Ihor for that very warm welcome and also for that great memento. Ihor, of course, is, you heard his introduction already, a great Ukrainian-Canadian story, retired Canadian military officer, gone on to be a successful entrepreneur, a leader of the community, as well as a co-founder of the Friends of Ukraine Defense Forces Fund. So it is a true pleasure on my part to be introduced by such a great Canadian. Give Ihor another big hand. Now, friends, I am very greatly honored to be invited here tonight. I'm told I'm getting a couple of awards, I guess depending on how my speech goes. But seriously, I am very honored to be receiving the Order of Liberty from the sovereign and independent state of Ukraine. It is a great friend and ally of Canada and also the cause that brings us together, a cause without borders. I'm also honored by the Pinnacle Award, which is being bestowed by the International Council in Support of Ukraine. This umbrella organization embraces the various sponsors of this tribute gala, and of course those include the League of Ukrainian Canadians, celebrating its 70th anniversary, the League of Ukrainian Canadian Women, marking its 65th anniversary, the Ukrainian Echo news publication, also now observing its 70th anniversary, and of course, more generally, by the Ukrainian Canadian community itself, now present for 129 years in our great country. A big hand to all of these sponsoring organizations. As I say, the Ukrainian Canadian community that you represent, and I know there are representatives, I met representatives here tonight from virtually every part of our country. What a great contribution you have made in that 129 years. You know, I'm often asked abroad the question that Ihor raised in his introduction. Why do Canadians, why do I, but I get the question more broadly, why do Canadians so strongly support Ukraine? Because the fact is this, and I say it proudly, there is no other country in the world where support for Ukraine in its current struggles is more widespread and more unconditional than in our country, Canada. I answer that question this way. I say that in part of the reason is obviously that the Ukrainian-Canadian community, in absolute numbers, is arguably the largest Ukrainian diaspora anywhere in the world, certainly the largest outside of Eastern Europe. But there is more to it than just numbers. Ukrainian Canadians are present almost everywhere in this country, and you constitute a long-standing, successful, and highly respected community. I tell foreigners that virtually every Canadian has a Ukrainian friend, a Ukrainian neighbor, or a Ukrainian colleague, as I did from my earliest childhood. And virtually all of those relationships that people have with Ukrainian Canadians are good ones. I also like to think that Canadians see in your mother country a small echo of ourselves. Now, what I have in mind when I say that is a comparison you may not have thought about it. It's the War of 1812. And I'm not talking about the belief that some Ukrainians may actually have fought on the Canadian side in the War of 1812, but rather what I want to talk about is the heritage of that struggle. In 1812, our American neighbors launched an invasion of this country. The premise of that invasion was that Canada was really just an extension of America, and that Canadians were culturally part of a greater American nation. And so the American view was the success of that invasion would be, according to none other than Thomas Jefferson, quote, a mere matter of marching. That assumption was, of course, utterly wrong. The invasion failed miserably. By the end of the war, most of the battles were actually being fought on American soil. More importantly, the invasion had brought to the fore the deep cultural distinctiveness of Canadians, whether British or French or Aboriginal or other, including at that time, of course, German Canadians and Black Canadians. And so instead of the absorption, the invasion actually began the process of creating a common Canadian identity that would eventually lead to a truly Canadian nation. This modest parallel in the history of the relationship between Americans and Canadians to the history of the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians is obvious enough. But there are, of course, many, many big differences. And one of those is that the evolution of the American attitude from conqueror to neighbor has not yet occurred in the Russian mindset. A big reason for that is, of course, the rise and the consolidation of power by Vladimir Putin. Now, friends, normally when I address groups these days, I'm asked to speak about the big geopolitical developments and trends in the world today. And in that context, I tend to focus on Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. I don't usually focus on Putin. But in truth, I've got to tell you this. People ask me, I'm not sure why, but people ask me more often about Putin than any other leader I've dealt with in the world. So let me spend a few moments on that subject because I know it will be of interest to you. I think you are all aware of the last words I ever spoke to Vladimir Putin: Vladimir, get out of Ukraine. Now, actually, I got to tell you, that's not quite true. Something else happened. That wasn't the whole conversation. I'll let you in on the whole conversation for those who have never heard the story. I didn't put this out, by the way. We were meeting, we were together, we found ourselves together, a group of leaders in a green room prior to the G20 summit, and he came over. And, I said to him, Vladimir, get out of Ukraine. The Russians put out this story. I normally don't talk about private events. The Russians put out this story. I don't know why. They put out this story, but anyway, what actually happened, there was the rest to it. I said, Vladimir, get out of Ukraine. What happened next? He looked at me with that smirk he gets when he's just been accused of poisoning someone. And he said to me, but I'm not in Ukraine. To which I said, well, Vladimir, that is why it is a waste of my time to talk to you. And so those were actually the last words I ever spoke to Vladimir Putin. I didn't know at the time. I read later what Teddy Roosevelt said about dealing with the Russians and Russian leaders. And I wish I'd known that at the time. Teddy Roosevelt said, the worst thing about dealing with Russian leaders is that they will lie to you even when they know that you know they are lying. Anyway, and of course, as was mentioned even before that particular event, I had led the charge in the end successfully to have Putin expelled from the G8. So I'm not on his Christmas card list. In fact, Russia is one of the very few countries in the world today where Harper and Associates cannot do business. But still, people often ask me, what is Putin like? And when people ask me that, because I spent a lot of years with Putin in a lot of meetings, they are invariably expecting, if not soliciting, from me a highly negative evaluation. The fact of the matter is, though, friends, I have never taken Putin lightly. And I'll tell you that Putin is in many ways a very impressive individual. The first thing you're struck by when you met Putin are his eyes. They are bright, they are intelligent, and they are dead cold. All of his thoughts, his words, and his actions exhibit extraordinarily high levels of personal discipline. Although I did tell once, I can tell you this, I had a unique capacity to get under his skin. I I did get under his skin once to a sufficient degree. I guess this was around the time I started referring to the G7+1. He got under his skin to such a degree that he actually called me a Trotskyite. He said I was a Trotskyite. All I told Vladimir was that. I said, look, Vladimir, all the insults I've received in my political career, that is the most unique. But certainly, Putin, just to be clear, Putin never enters a meeting, an international meeting, without being thoroughly briefed, one of the best briefed people in the world. And he doesn't enter without having a very clear objectives for the outcome of that meeting. His comprehension of English is very good, although he seldom uses it. As a former intelligence officer, he is very quick to size people up, and in particular, he is very quick to spot weaknesses in character. Though he is quite personable, Putin is rarely very warm. He can even seem shy in social situations, and I never once saw him display any sense of humor. Although the late Deepak Oberoi told me he once saw Putin laugh at a very macabre joke. But anyway, that's Putin. How does he think? How does Vladimir Putin think? Putin's mindset has been shaped first and foremost by the fall of the Soviet Union. Remember that those events ended the careers and often the lives of most of the people that Putin knew professionally in his early years. It also began a decade of cataclysmic political, economic, and social decline for Russia. That is why Putin has called the USSR's disappearance, and you know the quote, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Given his KGB mindset, Putin sees those events as a series of foreign plots and domestic betrayals. Yet it is a mistake to think that Putin is still a communist. In fact, the Communist Party is his most consistent domestic political opponent. In Putin's mind, he is not a communist, he is a nationalist, or even in his mind, he is a conservative. He brandishes with pride his Russian Orthodox religion and his belief in business, although, of course, it is an organized crime rather than a free market version of business. And through that, as we all know, through the gangster model, Putin has made himself one of, if not the, richest person in the world. But Putin does not really want wealth. What Putin really wants is power. He wants power in the deepest personal sense, and understand this about Putin. He will never, ever relinquish it willingly or voluntarily. Do not believe the stories, these Kremlin watchers you see about the recent maneuverings and how they might somehow mean that Putin will somehow give up power one day. He never will, not as long as he is alive. And he never will, because Putin is smart enough to know that when you have used power the way he has used power, you either keep it or you die. But Putin does also want power for a larger goal, the goal of restoring power to Russia and to Russians. It is not the Soviet Union that he wishes to recreate. It is the Russian Empire, albeit in modern form. And this is really the key to understanding Putin's agenda. It is essentially backward looking. He's a tactician, he's not a strategist. He has no forward vision for his country. He is building nothing in the way of institutions or other aspects of society that will outlast him. Internationally, he tries to advance Russia's power, and in a few places he has, but mostly remember what it is all about. It is all about undermining American power and undermining the Western alliance. That is in his mind. It's really all about getting revenge for the Cold War and trying to reverse its outcome. I watched up close two American presidents, both of whom I have great admiration for, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I watched both American presidents go to great lengths to try and make Vladimir Putin a constructive partner. You can't. You can't because he doesn't want to be. It is not his objective. Yet, as we know, a third president in a row has also been trying. This is one of Putin's skills, by the way, to convince others that he is simply misunderstood, and that he really could be an ally if only you tried a little bit harder. I figured this out pretty early on about Putin, and I want to remind you, I do have to say this, I want to remind you that most foreign policy commentators in and outside of government, I will not include our former ambassador in this, but most foreign policy commentators in this country, in government, in the media, etc., didn't figure this out until 2014. Some of you remember that as late as 2013, when I began publicly calling for Putin to be thrown out of the G8, I'd been calling for it a few years before that, they were all saying that I was making a terrible mistake not trying to work with Putin. But they were not the only ones. They were not the only ones. I go back to, remember back in 2006, the NATO summit. President Bush and I, and frankly most of the other leaders, tried to get Ukraine into NATO. It was blocked by a small handful of allies. They blocked it because they did not want to offend Putin. You know, years later, and I have to tell you this, years later, after the invasions of the Crimea and the Donbass, one of those leaders tried to justify their position to me. That leader said to me, you know, Stephen, if we'd followed your advice and let Ukraine into NATO, we would now be at war with Russia. To which I said, no, if you'd followed my advice and Ukraine were part of NATO, this invasion never would have happened in the first place. Look, friends, I see it all the time. One of the great challenges of foreign policy is a leader has to have a vision for what the world should look like. And as a Canadian, those visions are obviously based on freedom, democracy, justice, the things on which our society stands for and the reasons for which it's flourished. But at the same time, you have to be realistic about the world that you're facing, about the people at the other side of the table, and what they are really like. You have to be able to recognize that Vladimir Putin is a dangerous person. But you also have to be able to recognize that Vladimir Putin is a dangerous person, but believe it or not, he is not a reckless person. He is an apparatchik. He is analytical, he is calculating, he is cautious. He does not wish to repeat Soviet overextensions, and he is a bully. Vladimir Putin will never enter a fight which he cannot win and win easily. By the way, that is the real reason why he didn't invade the rest of Ukraine, the non-Russian parts, when he probably could have. But friends, here is the good news. I said that when I talk about the big important developments in geopolitical events these days, I talk about Trump and I talk about Xi, and I don't talk very much about Putin. Yes, Putin is a player, but he is a player just in the sense that he is just a disruptor. He is a mercenary, a hacker, a rule breaker. He is prepared to make a deal with anyone naive enough to believe his rhetoric. But in the wider scheme of things, he is not that important outside of a few areas. He leads a rapidly declining power, and he is accelerating the decline of that power. Friends, a lot of people don't know, you probably know it, but a lot of Canadians don't even realize that when we kicked Russia out of the G8, we kicked the smallest of the G8's economies out of that organization. Yes, the Russian economy, with almost 150 million people and some of the largest oil and gas reserves in the world, is smaller than the Canadian economy. It's incredible, but it is true. And that is one reason why I'm optimistic about Ukraine. Let's take the long view of history once again. I go back to the War of 1812. It took over 100 years from the end of that war in 1815 for the United States and Canada to truly become allies and friends. In fact, for many decades following the war, Canadians prepared for another invasion. Fortifications were built, people were trained. As late as the early years of the 20th century, people still felt it was possible that we might face another American invasion. But eventually, with the failure of the first invasion, and more importantly, the defeat of the logic behind the invasion, the threat gradually subsided, and a different and, of course, more appropriate relationship emerged, one of the best in the world. This will happen in time with Russia. I may not see it, but someday the Putin era will end, and Russians' desire for a better life under better institutions with better friends in the world will emerge. And the logic of trying to annex a fundamentally different nation will ebb away. But for some time to come, we will have to be vigilant and we will have to be patient, just as you have been. You have really been. Indeed, in human history, there have been very few desires for nationhood that have been more thoroughly tested and proven more resilient than that of the Ukrainian nation. During my visits to Ukraine, as we saw in some of the films, I saw the memorials to Ukraine's tortured past, and I saw the testaments to its determination to endure. In Kiev, I visited the statue of Ukraine's national poet, Taras Shevchenko, persecuted by the Tsar for demanding freedom. I laid a wreath at the monument to the Holodomor, a deliberate mass murder by famine in which millions died. Millions died. And once again, it was mentioned earlier, but I'm proud to say that it was our government, and more explicitly, it was member of our caucus, James Bazan, who led the move to call the Holodomor what it was: Stalin's genocide against the Ukrainian people. Full stop. I should mention, by the way, that I'm very pleased to have been asked to sit on the advisory board of the Holodomor Museum that's going to be opening in Ukraine. And I'm doing that because we want to ensure that this horror and its victims are never, ever forgotten by humanity. I also stood at Babin Yar, where another homicidal regime, the Nazis, killed thousands. In Lviv, as mentioned, I visited the Lonsky Street prison, where the restored Soviet regime interrogated, tortured, and subjected thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and even children to the most horrifying crimes. And of course, in the streets, I saw the pictures of the victims of the Maidan Revolution, fought against Putin's henchman, Yanukovych, only the most recent attempt by Russia's despots to bring Ukraine to heel. But long before I saw any of those things, I could see as a boy the Ukrainians that I knew in that era lived under a cloud of sadness. The Russian Empire, the Stalinist Holodomor, the Nazi occupation, the Soviet reoccupation. There was much, so much to be sad about. Not just lost opportunities, but lost generations and so many lost lives. Many people I grew up with in this country thought it would last forever. But never in my experience did Ukrainians think that. Nor, I might add, did anyone, I should add, in my Canadian conservative political tradition that I am very proud of. Going back to John Diefenbaker, conservatives, we had no so-called peace missions to the Soviet Union. We sought no middle way between totalitarianism and freedom. We were not trying to play an so-called honest broker or neutral party between right and wrong. And when the time came, as Ukrainians always knew it would, it was a conservative government that was the first in the West, even before the fall of the Soviet Union, to recognize Ukrainian independence. And friends, when that independence was threatened time and again, and as foreign affairs officials urged me, I could tell you they did, not our ambassador, but as foreign affairs officials urged me and urged our government to appease Russia, the various conservative parties over the years and the government that I led said, no, we will not, and we will not ever do that. And friends, look, you are honoring me tonight, and I am grateful for that. But in doing so, I always say with these are honors that really go to this country, the vast majority of whose citizens of all political persuasions have always stood by Ukraine, and which, under conservatives, as I say, always has. And I say, for the conservative leadership aspirants who are here tonight, I believe always will. So friends in the Ukrainian Canadian community, let me conclude tonight by saying to you something I have said before, something I said many years ago. And it is this: we, like you, are determined that the journey forward for Ukraine will continue, and that there will be no going back. That journey began with the birth of freedom for those Ukrainians who came to Canada. Here Ukrainians experienced, sometimes through considerable hardship, all the opportunities that a free and democratic society has to offer. Other kinds of societies might, on occasion, satisfy their citizens' material needs, but they never satisfy their aspirations and their dreams. And so you have succeeded here in Canada, and as you have succeeded, your hopes for your struggling homeland have only grown stronger. In my political lifetime, you have journeyed back to Ukraine multiple times to monitor and protect free elections. You have sought ways to aid and to invest there, including supporting the free trade agreement that Ukraine concluded with my government. You have built memorials to the struggles of the past, embracing in particular that important monument in Ottawa to the tens of millions of victims of communism in Ukraine and around the world. You've backed efforts by our government to militarily reinforce outgunned Ukrainian soldiers, to persuade our allies to do more, and tonight, of course, to continue to aid the victims and the families of a Russian aggression that has never really ceased. Most of all, friends, you all know that we have all come too far, way too far from the horrors of Ukraine's past to ever allow it to go back. I do not know, you know, Yogi Berra said predictions are tough, especially about the future. I do not know how long the Kremlin will want to undermine Ukraine's stability, prosperity, and sovereignty. Is it like Canada's experience, a period that will last a century? Or will it be a millennium? Or could it be just a decade? I don't know. But I do know this: Ukrainian Canadians will continue the fight until it is concluded successfully and once and for all, and your fellow Canadian citizens will be standing beside you. Ukraine, like Canada, will one way or another be a land eventually of freedom, dignity, and true independence. I want to thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I greatly admire the work you're all doing as part of the International Council in support of Ukraine and all of the organizations that it embraces, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. God bless all of you. God bless Canada. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Thank you. It is an honor to call upon Ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, His Excellency Andriy Shevchenko, for a special presentation of the Order of Liberty. This is the highest order of Ukraine, which can be awarded to a non-Ukrainian citizen.
Every Ukrainian life in 2014 was divided into two: the life before and the life after. And each of us remembers where he or she was in those final days of Maidan and in the first days of the Russian aggression into Ukraine. We remember what we did, and we remember what our friends did at that time. I can say that we were so lucky to have Stephen Harper as Canadian Prime Minister at that time. In the darkest nights of Maidan, when there was not many things around us, but just smoke, fire, blood, and death, when hell fell down onto the streets of Kyiv, we held on to a couple of very simple and very important thoughts. First, we believed that justice and freedom would prevail. Second, we hoped that the world saw us and the world would support us. And then when Russia brought hell to Crimea and to Donbass, we held on to the same thoughts. Freedom will prevail, the free world will speak up. And Ukrainian Canadians spoke, Canada spoke through its Prime Minister, and the free world spoke. Thank you for being the leader of the free world at that time. I just literally flew in from our ambassadorial conference in Washington, D.C., and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vadim Pristaiko, reminded our ambassadors about your existential conversations with President Putin. And we spoke that we will always remember how in March of 2014 you were the first G7 leader who arrived to Ukraine after the occupation of Crimea. We will always remember your decisions to send ammunition and boots to Ukraine, your decision to start Operation Unifier, your decision to complete the free trade agreement. And we also know that you supported Ukraine not just because it was morally right, not just because of the extraordinary Ukrainian-Canadian community, but because you saw that Ukraine would create an added value for Canada as a partner in so many fields, in security, in trade, in education, in culture, and so on and on and on. This is the framework that we cherish so much now, when we enjoy fantastic bipartisan support in Canada across the aisle. And much of this started in 2014, thanks to your visionary leadership. Order of Liberty of Ukraine is indeed the highest Ukrainian award that not a citizen of Ukraine can receive. And if you have many awards from Ukraine, just for you to know, this one should be worn above all the others. There were only 21 foreign citizens who received this award, and the list of those awarded includes John McCain, Joe Biden, as well as extraordinary, legendary Ukrainians such as Mustafa Dzhemilov and Levko Lukyanenko. Today I am here on behalf of two presidents of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, who signed this decision, and President Zelensky, who continues a very strong tradition of friendship and partnership with Canada. But most of all, I am here on behalf of all Ukrainians and on behalf of Ukraine. I represent the country which will always remember what you did, with gratitude, respect, and admiration. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating Right Honorable Stephen Harper.
The Pinnacle Award was established in 2015 by the International Council in Support of Ukraine, ICSU, the international umbrella organization for both LUC and LUCW. The award is bestowed upon individuals who have achieved an outstanding record of support for Ukraine's independence and integration into the community of democratic nation states. The Pinnacle Award represents that commitment to individually and collectively uphold the universal principles of civilized cooperation as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and its declarations and covenants on human rights and national self-determination. The former Prime Minister is a champion of Canadian values, a staunch advocate of universal human rights and freedoms, and a defender of democracy and the rule of law. He is an admired friend of the Ukrainian Canadian community, the international Ukrainian diaspora, and Ukraine itself. The League of Ukrainian Canadians, League of Ukrainian Canadian Women, and the International Council in Support of Ukraine have the honor of presenting the Pinnacle Award to the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, 22nd Prime Minister of Canada, for his outstanding record and many contributions to the Ukrainian community, to Ukrainian-Canadian relations, and support of Ukraine. We call upon the President of the ICSU, Boris Potapenko, the President of the League of Ukrainian Canadian Women, Oksana Kuzishin, and the President of the League of Ukrainian Canadians, Roman Medik, to present the Pinnacle Award to the Right Honourable Stephen Harper.
Дорогі пані і панове, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly a great honor for me personally and for the International Council in Support of Ukraine collectively, but especially on behalf of the League of Ukrainian Canadians and League of Ukrainian Canadian Women, to acknowledge and to honor Prime Minister Stephen Harper for his steadfast, unyielding, and enduring support of our ancestral homeland. What Prime Minister Harper has done for Ukraine during his time in office can only be compared to what Ronald Reagan did for the demise of the Soviet Union. We honor you, Mr. Prime Minister, and are very grateful to you.